Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Chee-Tash. My name is Chris, and today we are going over Chapter 8 from Motor City Drama by Russell Lee Durant. Going inside the Big Three, behind the scenes of building the Big Three with Ford, Durant, and Chrysler. Today, we're going to circle back to Walter Chrysler. In Chapter 8, Walter Chrysler gets his own company. If you guys remember, Walter Chrysler was heading up the Buick division at GM, and he's getting paid a lot of money. He brings tremendous value to Buick, and what we're going to see here is he eventually gets a little bit sick and tired of being at GM, and he ends up leaving GM. Let's just get right into the story, because a big part of the story is this company, Willis Overland Motor Company. And Willis Overland Motor Company is this car company not in Michigan, not in Metro Detroit or Flint, Lansing. It is actually in Toledo, Ohio. And Willis Overland ends up hiring Walter Chrysler to be their general manager. And at Willis Overland, what ends up happening is that they have to make some cuts because the company is not really doing too well. So it says here, Russell writes in the book, the banks holding loans to the company hired Walter to turn it around. After setting up his office there, he called in John Willis, one of the founders, who was the president. And Walter Chrysler cuts the president's salary from $150 a year to $75K a year. So he cuts it in half. That's pretty cutthroat, if I do say so myself. After 2 years at Willis Overland, Walter ends up leaving. And it's kind of funny because he cuts John Willis's salary, and then he's kind of unhappy when they kind of want to cut his salary because his salary's too high. So there's a conversation that Russell writes here that takes place between Willis and Chrysler. So it goes a little something like this. But surely there are other places to cut costs. I am the president of the company, and after all, have important responsibilities here and should be compensated for that. And then Walter goes, if you were worth $150K a year, I wouldn't be here. The investment bankers who hired me want new directions and not whatever directions you were leading them. In fact, at $75K, you are probably still overpaid. And then it goes on near the end of Walter's 2-year contract, a meeting to discuss renewing his salary, goes through the bankers. They're pleased with the progress in the company, but they're complaining about his high salary. And then there's actually a quote in the book. There's this very large volume called Chrysler, The Life and Times of an Automotive Genius by Vincent Curcio. And Russell here is very nice with his quote. If that's the way you can feel, you can stick this job. But in the book, Vincent writes that Walter is quoted as saying, you can stick that job in your ass, which is kind of funny. And Walter kind of ends up leaving. He ends up hooking up with Jonathan Maxwell and Ben Briscoe, which are some names that we've heard of before, if you guys remember from earlier episodes, in this whole time period of automobile company foundings. So they have this company, Maxwell Company, and Walter joins up after leaving Willis. And when Walter joins up, he actually brings a couple of the engineers with him who are called the Three Musketeers: Fred Zetter, Owen Skelton, and Carl Breer. Now, in 1924, they design a new model for the Maxwell Car Company called the Chrysler 6, the 1924 Chrysler 6. And it's a pretty special car. It's got Walter's name on it and Chrysler's name that we know today. And they were a little bit late, though, in exhibiting it at the 1924 New York Auto Show. It did not qualify for the admission because it had not yet gone into production. So what Walter does is he ends up arranging it to be displayed in the lobby of the Commodore Hotel down the street. And from that marketing of, I'm assuming here, a pretty nice hotel, they get a ton of orders start coming in for a price range of around $2,000. And this kind of really lifts the Maxwell company off the ground, and it becomes one of the most profitable companies, automobile companies, along with GM and Ford. And Walter takes that success, runs with it, ends up starting his own company called the Chrysler Corporation in 1925. They end up merging Maxwell in with it. The stockholders then dissolved Maxwell and transferred all of its stock to Chrysler Corporation. And it's funny here, there's a quote. Walter told a friend, "It's odd, but the first Chrysler car was not made by Chrysler Corporation. And I was not its first president because the first president of Chrysler Corporation was his attorney, Nicholas Kelly." It's kind of little fun facts there. And it's interesting, in the book, Vincent actually describes that this story of Walter displaying the Chrysler 6 in the Commodore Hotel did not actually happen. So it's kind of interesting. There's conflicting sources here saying that happened. If it did, that's a pretty boss move. Say, okay, you're not going to have me in your auto show? Well, all right, we're going to go down the hotel down the street. We're going to build our own audience down there. So I thought that was really interesting, if that happened, that is. Next, KT Keller joins Chrysler. So KT was at GM, leading GM's efforts in Canada, GM of Canada. And Walter he's trying to recruit him to be the vice president of manufacturing at Chrysler in 1926. And KT is very intrigued by the potential of Chrysler. And he eventually joins, and they add a few new lines of cars, namely the one that I remember here is the Plymouth. I don't think they make Plymouths anymore, but even like when I was growing up, I remember Plymouths and that car kind of driving around and seeing that car, people still driving that car. So KT says to Walter, this is a conversation, "Walter, you intrigue me. GM is getting to be a huge company, and I could get lost there, but significant ground floor opportunity with your new company is tempting, very tempting." And Walter goes, "Good. Now let's talk about money and work out a deal." And with that, KT joins. Not only do they add the Plymouth line, but they also add this DeSoto line shortly thereafter. Let's go to the next slide. Dodge and Chrysler merge. This was really interesting. So, if you guys remember, the Dodge brothers died tragically very young. I believe it was in 1920. Their widows end up taking over the company. And this guy, Dillon Reed Investments, the guy's name is actually Clarence Dillon, I believe. So Clarence ends up buying it from the widows. And then he ends up selling it to Walter Chrysler for some more plant capacity for newer models. Reed was willing to sell it. It really sounded like, and this is detailed a ton in the Chrysler book by Vincent Curcio. It really seems like Walter kind of gamed Reed here. It really honestly seemed like Reed needed to get rid of the company more so than Walter needed it. You guys know what I'm saying there? And he did need more space, but it's not like he couldn't get it maybe anywhere else, and he wasn't in dire straits to necessarily get it from Reed. So they end up reaching an agreement in New York, and KT Keller, the gentleman we mentioned previously, he ends up getting promoted to the head of Dodge. All right. So a little bit of a backstory, just from reading this Chrysler book as well as the account that Russell displays in his book. We've got this company, Willis Overland, right, out of Toledo, Ohio. Since 1907, it's being run by John Willis. He previously made his money in bicycles in the state of New York. And lots of bicycles, lots of people into bicycles. If you guys remember, the Dodges were into bicycles as well. Durant was into carriages, horse-driven carriages. So yeah, lots of people getting their start in other areas of transportation before moving over to the automobile. I mean, gosh, who was it? It wasn't Chrysler. Might have been Buick that we were talking about, worked on in the railroad industry. Yeah. Or it was either Buick or Leland that got their start in the railroad industry. I think it was Buick. So this guy, John Willis, he's a salesman. He likes the automobile industry. He wants to sell the cars, but he just has a problem getting the cars. So what he ends up doing is he ends up contracting to sell cars for two Indianapolis companies, American Underslung, and the other one being this Overland company. All right. And this is where the name Willis Overland comes about, because Willis contracts out with Overland, and he pre-sells 500 of its cars in 1907. But the panic of 07 sets in. The economy takes a downturn. Overland almost goes bankrupt. They're not going to be able to deliver on those 500 cars. And what Willis does is very interesting. He ends up essentially taking over the company via gathering up the receipts from the hotel and restaurant he stayed at. I have no clue how this works financially. If he just said to hey, if he says to the hotel, hey, I'm going to take on your debt and then I'm going to use that debt to cover the cost of Overland in order to produce these cars that I've pre-sold. He even said, it says in the book, Vincent writes, that they didn't have enough money to pay the workers. They would have went bankrupt the day after, because the checks that they were going to pay the workers weren't going to clear. So if they would have waited an extra day, Overland would have been bankrupt. But Willis steps in. Again, financially, I'm not as illiterate in how this game is played of using what he did with the receipts to purchase Overland, but he ends up owning Overland after this is all said and done. And the company is not in a good place. Like it says here, they're in debt. He owes about $46 million. So, okay. So at Willis, this is Willis Overland. Walter is out of a job, and he's being approached by Willis to come join the company. And he's apprehensive to join because he didn't want to ruin his reputation. He had an outstanding reputation at GM where he turned the company around, well, specifically the Buick division, did outstanding there, and he's kind of apprehensive to go to this, startup company, essentially, that's not really doing very well. And if it goes bad, now all of a sudden he's not the bright and shiny prospect that we all thought he was. It's kind of like a football player who was super good on one team, goes to another team and is not as good. Now we almost think, oh, well, were the years when he was on that previous team kind of a fluke? So he's asking for $1 million salary, unheard of at that time. He wants to be fully in charge because he's learned his lesson from being at GM where he was quote unquote in charge, but Billy Durant still made like some final decisions, kind of overstepped him on some of the decisions. So late at a 1921 board meeting, they're kind of trying to figure out, hey, if Walter's really worth it. They don't like his high salary, but Walter's done well at Willis. He's reduced the debt at Willis by $25 million. So that's pretty good. I mean, and we're talking about the 20s here. $25 million hits different in the 20s than it does in the 2020s. And he basically tells them, hey, you know, if you don't like that salary, if you don't like paying me that much, you can stick that job up your ass. And he ends up leaving. All the while, what else is going on at this point? Well, we've got the Dodge and Reed story here. So, like I was saying, the company's put up for sale in 1925. The wives, the widows of the two Dodge brothers, they're looking to sell it. They reach out to Henry Ford. Ford declines. And remember, Ford had a relationship with the Dodge brothers, but he declines it. GM makes an offer through JP Morgan. This is kind of like not the exact details of it, but they offered $50 million in cash plus $90 million in non-interest bearing notes, or $124.65 million. So, okay, that was GM's offer. But Clarence Dillon of Dillon Reed and Company offers $146 million, pretty much all cash. And at that point, it was like the largest check ever written because the widows end up selling Dodge to Clarence. And he was known as the man who wrote the check for $146 million. It was a straight check. It was like one of the largest checks ever written at the time. Well, then what happens? There is a merger because Walter at this time also starts Chrysler out of that, out of the beginnings of the Maxwell Company, which he joins after Willis Overland. So Chrysler made Dillon desperate by unveiling the DeSoto. So kind of skipping a little bit of details here, but Dillon was looking to sell. Chrysler was looking to buy, but he kind of tempted. He made it very tough for Dillon. He basically put Dillon in kind of a bind. And he unveils this new car called the DeSoto in 1926. He hires the Dodge sales manager to unsell dealers on the Dodge, upsell the DeSoto. So 1,500 dealers are selling the car in 1929. And DeSoto was announced in 1928. By year's end, 34,518 of these cars are shipped to dealers. 81,000 by the end of the first 12 months. He's basically using DeSoto, I think, here as, I think, kind of leverage to say that, hey, or not necessarily leverage, because I think he used DeSoto to like speed things up with Clarence. Because, right, he needed the factory space in order to produce this car, right? So he ends up like putting into production and stuff and then going to Clarence and basically saying, hey, my car's already in production. If you're going to sell this to me, like, we need it now, basically, because I need the space and the production power to start producing this DeSoto, etc. Let me take a quick peek at the book. Yeah, it might have been something like that. Something like that, some sort of leverage to have over Clarence when he was. Oh, right here on page 379 of the book. We started on the DeSoto idea in 1926, right after I joined the corporation, KT Keller said. It was a brilliant strategy for the Chrysler people. Were devaluing the car they were trying to buy, which was really important to them for its plant, while at the same time they were adding a new line that turned out to be a wild success solely due to Walter Chrysler's reputation as a car builder. We decided to bring out the DeSoto, but first we needed another car to compete with Dodge and to line up dealers as a hedge. Okay, so maybe they put the DeSoto out there to compete with Dodge so that Dodge's sales would tank so the company would be worth a little bit less. So, and then Clarence would come in with like a lower offer. And Walter did say that he thought that Clarence overvalued Dodge. It ends up being where a deal is end up being struck. Dillon had to deliver 90% of all classes of Dodge Brothers stock, which paid a higher dividend than Chrysler. Chrysler offers 1 share per Dodge preferred stock, 1 share of Chrysler common stock for every 5 Dodge non-voting common stock, and 1 share of Chrysler common stock for 10 shares of Dodge voting stock. I know this is like super in the details, but for you financial folks out there and you love this kind of stuff and like the nitty gritty of it, definitely check out Chrysler by Vincent Curcio. Goes into lots of detail on this. And the new stock ends up being valued at $170 million. I believe the deal ends up being finalized in 1928. I believe it was 1928. And there's some detail too about if this was necessarily an acquisition or a merger or a dissolution. And I remember there was a reading in here, there was some discrepancy about that and how much of a difference it would be by characterizing it as a dissolution versus a merger or an acquisition. So maybe I'll do a blog post on that, specifically how Dodge and Chrysler merged together. But that actually is our last slide for the day, guys. Thank you very much for listening this far. I really, really appreciate it. We're a little more than halfway done with the book, so stick around, stay tuned to the very end. Hopefully you guys are learning something about automotive history, and I really appreciate you guys listening. Please, if you can, I now have a podcast, the Chee-Tash podcast, where I actually interviewed Russell Durant, and we talked about his book and some other things, automobile history related. Really, really cool conversation. There is a link in the description. There is a link in the description, but that podcast can also be found on Spotify, Apple, Google, Samsung, and some of the other podcast platforms. Thank you guys very much for listening. My name is Chris. This is Chee-Tash. Take care.